Okie doke. So we've been talking about when we went over last Thursday over to kind of the amphitheater area of Thompson Woods right outside the Student Center. We were just introducing the idea of what's been kind of the progression, what's the arc of the human experience from basically the end of the Stone Age to today and into the near future as far as it concerns forestry. Right? Things are not as they once were. And for the first time in human history, forestry practices are changing and advancing and sophisticating really pretty rapidly. Right? So we talk about ancient history in really, really big, broad strokes. We're bending together 300,000 years of modern human existence and development up to the point of 350,000 years up to the point of basically the end of the Stone Age, so early Iron Age, Bronze Age, and stuff like that. And then things start speeding up in terms of advancement and change with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution, the Renaissance, all that stuff, in no particular order. So, we spent Thursday talking about what was that first 380,000 years like. The emergence of modern humans in sub-Saharan Africa, around the Veldt or the Rift Valley, and the spread of Neanderthal and Homo sapiens sapiens much, much later through Europe and Asia. And then we get our last ice age, which opens up a land bridge across Siberia into modern-day Alaska. We get folks sort of percolating down through North America and then into South America, and then all across the Pan-Pacific Rim, so all the different Polynesian cultures, following about the year 500 to 1000, so the big Pacific diaspora, right? And life is hard. Life is nasty, brutish, and short for a lot of these peoples. We don't have modern antibiotics. We don't have modern OBGYNs. Humans as a species, as a mammal species, has the highest pregnancy risk rate, highest death to mother and child rate by far of any mammals that I'm aware of. And that means that we're not really focused on things like advanced geospatially informed, climate informed forestry management and recreation management. It is much more of a, what are we eating today kind of a thing. So we want to think about that in those terms, not in terms of the modern experience, right? Families tended to be large and lethality was very high, right? Here in North America and across what is now Northern Russian Federation, we have people hunting things like mammoths to extinction in order to survive. So, it is a difficult time. At the same time, though, as we get a little bit later into human civilization, human cultures, and sort of the diversity that starts opening up as we start to recognize the names of some of the nation states that we'll be talking about here. Social historians, the folks who are focused on kind of the everybody else, not the kings and queens, not the Pope, not the people who are above everybody else and who are exerting lots of geopolitical power, sending people off to war and stuff like that. They're focused on the serfs, the peasants, the regular folks. Today, a social historian would study folks like you and me, which is not to say that you guys can't be kings and queens. I have probably what the youth would call short king energy, right? Right? I'm a king in my own heart. But we're not billionaires. And so we think about things like leisure and recreation. We think about our needs relative to forestry very differently than somebody like Elon Musk, for example. Okay? So let's jump into the ancient era. So we're jumping forward from early humans and previous related species of hominids, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Homo superior, all of those. Now we are squarely into the historic era. All right, so ancient history is gonna be more or less collapsed down into the invention of, like we were talking about Thursday, row crop agriculture, animal husbandry agriculture, that is keeping animals alive so that they help keep us alive in kind of a commensalist or symbiotic way. So we have things like milk protein and calories from milk fat from cattle, which are domesticated from wild oxen and aurochs species and so forth, down into species like modern domesticated cattle and water bison common across Asia and Africa and so forth. That's kind of the era that we're talking about now. So this is mostly going to be 6,000 BCE and forward. All right, so we don't quite yet have the invention of writing, but we do have some early forms of recorded communications, mostly in the forms of religious statues and structures and so forth. And so we have one of our very first societies, cultures, nation states that we're going to talk about, ancient Mesopotamia. So if you guys have taken your 6th or 7th grade geography or civics class, Mesopotamia is going to be that first place where the civilization is set between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and with annual floods, we have things like early rudimentary row crop, not row crop, but just like scatter crop agriculture. So you have people who have saved bags or urns, big ceramic essentially barrels or pots of seeds from the last year, and grab handfuls of seeds and scatter them out. And then maybe eventually, a couple of thousand years go by, and people figure out we get a lot more of these seeds actually taking and surviving out to seeding out if we take a stick and poke the seed a couple of inches into that fertile floodplain soil. And then just keep on walking and stick poking and calling it good. We see a modern equivalent to this in aerating soil, right? We roll a big roller over turf and pull up plugs of soil so that the soil particles aren't too packed or consolidated together, and gases and moisture and nutrients can migrate up and down and sideways through soil from that aeration process. Okay? But somebody had to figure that out for the first time. And these early ancestral grains that people are growing are not Monsanto, GMO, enormous ear of corn kinds of things. It's like eating grass seeds, because that's literally what the original cereal grains were. And then eventually, over thousands of years, we start to learn to save more of the seeds that are bigger, save more of the seeds of the more productive plants, and selectively start breeding away from the wild type towards the cultivar cereal grains that we use today. Okay? So, this approach with early horses, with early horse-powered and oxen-powered agriculture, and so forth, this is one of the first places and times, ancient China is going to be the other, where we have one of the first times in human existence, about 6,000 years ago, where we have surplus calories. We are producing and storing, even despite the losses to spoilage, which could be up to half of the grains that you collect. We have, for each person, each day, a little bit more on average. Sometimes we have years of famine, sometimes we have years of late floods destroying the crops that we planted, and we got to figure out something else real soon now. But if everybody needs 2,000 calories a day, we're producing 2,100 calories a day per person. And so, right away, this leads to an explosion of civilization. We have things where people are starting to not all be hunter-gatherers, not all be stick-poking seeds into the ground. We have divisions of labor, one of the earliest hallmarks of a beginning civilization. Not everybody has to do the same thing in order to get just that basic number of calories across the finish line each day, each month, each year. And so this leads to, again, division of labor, where we have artisans, folks who are spending some or all of their time doing anything other than subsistence farming. And so we have the very first, not foresters, but woodsmen, or woods people, I don't know. And this leads to, that separation or division of labor leads to a stratification of society. If not everybody is farming, some people are going to be peacekeepers, full-time soldiers, the police force. So a military is typically externally focused, except in militocracies and things like fascist regimes. The military is focused outward on war making and protecting borders from invaders. And then a police force is domestic, and they are held separate, at least in countries like the United States and most of Western Europe. So, with that division of labor, we have a power structure that emerges. And all of this is, again, just based on the fact that not everybody has to farm all the time. This is a crucially fundamental underpinning of society level thing. We have what emerged to be rulers. Strongmen who use the power of the military and the police force, and typically who are working with the religious class, the priests, the shamans, the folks who do the rites and rituals and make the sacrifices, typically in this part of the world, animal sacrifices and food sacrifices, so grain and drink sacrifices like wine, to the gods to appease them so that the flood comes next year, right? So think about ancient Egypt right through this time, okay? This is, at the early end of this, is when the pyramids are getting built and so forth, right? And you need that fertile crescent, or that fertile valley of the Nile to flood regularly every year and basically take a huge chunk of the Sahara and turn it into a vibrant, highly productive, one of the most productive ecosystems in the world for agriculture, right? So everything comes down to having more ramen than you need to eat. I'm kidding, please don't just eat ramen. That's a great way to die. Anyway, so with that emergence of power structures, of anything beyond just a chieftain who is like a farmer like everybody else, but who happens to help make decisions for a small nomadic people group, we have things like kings and queens. And later, once we have multiple different nation states, countries, then we have empires. So an empire is a country that rules over other countries in kind of a federated system. So not so much the United States of America, we're all Americans, but an empire would be like if we ruled Venezuela and Venezuela had to pay us a whole bunch of taxes every year, otherwise we'd go invade them again and smack them around until they paid us a bunch of taxes. And that's going to be a thing for a really long time. There are not so many overt empires these days, like the British Empire is mostly being dismantled right now, and so forth. Canada looking to exit, Australia now looking to exit, and so forth. But back in this time, this was a huge way for early nations to make sure that the home nation has plenty of surplus calories, even in those fallow years, even in those famine years. Let's go conquer somebody else, and make them pay tribute or tax or a whole bunch of food to us, and maybe some gold, maybe some tin or bronze or whatever the metal technology was in that particular era. Okay? So, with these power structures, with this surplus calorie vibe going on, with these technological innovations of how to do basic to us farming, we see these power structures start to emerge, and some of the very first forestry and horticulture starts showing up right away. This is about as old as a culture as we can find, and they're starting to figure out things like, okay, the world around us is wild. We don't have interstates connecting everything together. We don't have safe planes to jump on with the FAA regulating safety and stuff like that. If you go out beyond the village wall, out beyond the farm fields beyond, it's kind of anything goes out there, right? It could be another straight up nomadic tribe of what we would today call wandering barbarians, for example, right? So the Barbary Coast has not been turned into a raiding society yet at this point, but there's a lot of highly mobile, pretty violent people who are looking pretty hungry, and they're going from village to village, kind of shaking people down, right? So ancient Mesopotamia is one of the first people groups to organize and build things like city walls and so forth, to start fencing out the bad people and fencing in fields and crops and so forth. So we get things like gardens, horticulture. Gardens, at this point, thousands of years ago, were not for pretty flowers. Gardens are a statement of power and connection to the gods. Because if all of the rest of the world is dangerous, if the forests out there are dark and dangerous, and when people go out into the forest to, for example, chop wood, to burn cook fires and stuff like that, to boil water and make it safe to drink, and cook those nasty tough grains into stuff like eventually pasta, well, then a garden is a statement of a society saying, yeah, the world out there is crazy, okay? Thousands of years after when we're talking about, the ancient Greeks are going to be thinking Mount Olympus is a crazy and dangerous place. It's so wild up there. It's so inaccessible. Lightning strikes that place so much that must be where the gods live, and that's where people can't exist safely. We'll just get obliterated, struck by lightning, fall off the mountain, that kind of stuff. Okay, so a garden flies in the face of all of that, saying everything out there is wild and untamed and deadly to us humans. But here is where we have tamed the wilds, right? That's a big flex on all of the things that are trying to kill you because they're hungry wild animals or hungry other people or the gods out there, right? That's kind of the sense of things, the worldview. Things are going great if we please the gods with our sacrifices, and if we get a drought or something like that, we must have done something wrong. Let's roll up the sacrifices and see if we can get that flood regime back for our next year's crops, and so forth. So gardens, forestry, landscape architecture, horticulture, these are a big deal. This is the collective expression of all of the wealth and expertise and knowledge and surplus capital and labor to tame a completely wild and untamable world, at least a little part of it, okay? And so, with that, because that's hard to do at this time, we start to see those gardens associated with the very highest levels of power in these societies, okay? Vineyards produce wine. Wine has alcohol. Wine is a self-sterilizing, safe way to drink. And with the advent of beer thousands of years later in Europe, we're going to have a couple of different ways to make water safe to drink. Okay? So basic existential needs like having safe water to drink and not dying of amoebic dysentery, violently shitting yourself to death. This is sort of centralized and systematized through religion. it's systemized and centralized through power structures, kings, queens, emperors. And parks take on a religious role and a statecraft role as well. So, jumping forward a little bit, a couple of thousand years from Mesopotamia, right? So, the earliest Mesopotamians, they are as far from the Romans as the Romans are from America in the year 3000, right? This is a long time. So, a lot of empires rising and falling. We're going to hit just a couple of highlights. So, we'll skip forward from 4000 BCE to 1000 BCE. And Babylon, which is not far from ancient Mesopotamia, in modern-day Iraq and eastern Turkey and so forth. All right, so now we are fully into the recognizable ancient societies around the Mediterranean. Now, this is well east of the east end of the Mediterranean in Iraq, but this is one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, right? The pyramids. Colossus of Rhodes or Sardia? One of them's a magic card, one of them was an ancient statue. Anyway, Colossus of Rhodes, I believe. Yeah, those hanging gardens were basically gigantic hanging planters, big earthenware pots that were really, really heavy. And water was really, really heavy. And so the seat of power in Babylon was a ziggurat, a step pyramid-like shape. And the ancient gardens, based on archaeology, were these hanging planter pots, enormous, like the size of a car or an SUV or bigger, up the steps of the ziggurat, up the different terraces or tiers. And looking at the archaeological reconstruction of this thing, it's a big stone and earthwork structure. I mean, just the amount of human labor to move those stones, or to build the pyramids, for example, right? That's an absolutely stupefying amount of spare calories. It's a stupefying amount of non-timber forest products in the form of foods. So if you think of things like, well, here in the US, some familiar species might be white oak, with its millions of acorns per mature tree. Pignut hickory, where you could just let pigs run through the forest and be fully fed without any slop, just off the mass-producing tree species in the eastern United States during the colonization era and so forth, right? So it's a big deal to be able to build a structure like this by hand, by carrying a bunch of stones and bricks and baskets of mud. To build the pyramids is a crazy amount of development on how to survive, okay? But these hanging gardens are, again, that sort of that flex on the wildness of nature, because water is 1 metric ton per cubic meter. So 3 by 3 by 3 feet-ish, about 30 cubic feet of water. It's about 2,200 pounds, right? 1,000 kilograms, a metric ton. So in order to keep these hanging gardens, these flexes against the wildness, the untamed, the danger of all of the world outside of the walls or the perimeter of Babylon, you got to haul literal tons of water up this ziggurat every day. And that's hard work. And it's not exciting work. And it's repetitive. And it's dull. But this is, again, a flex. This is an expression of an entire nation state. It's the pinnacle, the best idea they can come up with to demonstrate that, hey, Babylon is where it's at. We got it figured out. We can do this. We can defy gravity itself. we can define nature itself and tame it into a park, and tame it into hanging garden planters the size of a truck. Okay? Pretty cool stuff. Now, across the world, other societies are figuring out how to do the same thing. The Dravidians across the Indian subcontinent. Ancient China has a continuous record of civilization going back, I think, about 5,000 years, so right past the ancient Babylonians. The big innovation for the ancestral Chinese was the advent of night soil. Does anybody know what night soil is? So their big cereal grain, obviously, is rice. Rice needs to be grown in flooded paddies. And much of the geography of the West Beijing Plain, for example, is amenable to flooding fields easily before we have things like fossil fuel-powered pumps and canal systems and so forth. But they're not easily, until the advent of night soil, able to crack the nut on how to fertilize all that rice. Rice is relatively nutrient dense as cereal grains go, especially stuff like golden rice these days with genetically engineered in vitamin A and so forth to make it golden. But they were the first to figure out and put into sort of a nation-state-wide practice collecting human feces and then mixing with water and throwing it back out on the field, and collecting animal waste and collecting it, throwing it back out onto the field, flooding those paddies, and letting all of that tremendous amount of concentrated nutrients in our waste go back into the field. Now, what that doesn't solve is all of the parasites, for example, that might be in human feces, all the worms, like nematodes, for example. If you are not hot composting that animal or human waste up to about 150 degrees with modern hot composting and sterilizing it eventually by doing that, or sterilizing out a lot of those pathogens, what you're doing is essentially reinfecting everybody all the time forever. So, solve the nutrient problem, import or set up a new parasite problem. But there were already parasites all over everybody all the time anyway. In fact, with some mummified remains, accidentally mummified remains coming out of continental Europe 2,500 years after this, people like monks, for example, they had parasites all throughout their bodies, like detectable worms and stuff, even just in these mummified bodies and graves. Just absolutely unreal, like pooping worms every time you poop. Like, middle-aged people were built different. Anyway, so we have all of these societies getting together, not getting together with each other, but starting to figure out how do we answer the basic existential struggle questions. And we can do that better when we're working together with division of labor to protect our borders, to have not just farmers, but what we would call today modern agronomists, people who are trained and who understand the principles of how to do that farming in that particular ecosystem and culture, with rice as your cereal grain, or oats, or barley, or rye, or wheat, whatever the grain is, and so forth. And folks working together start to rapidly outpace those nomadic societies. And so there's kind of an arrested development in terms of technology for itinerant or migratory cultures versus those who settle down and who have to invent new technologies in order to remove some of the sharp edges of human existence, to file off some of the different, many lethal things. And in India, the way that specialization, that division of labor, that best and highest understanding of how to use land and surplus resources, that started to come together in some of the first, what we can identify archaeologically as royal restricted recreation areas. Some of the first parks. All right? Now, all semester long we've been saying that the United States our best idea, in the words of documentarian Ken Burns, America's national parks are America's best idea. Ancient civilizations didn't see it that way. Parks are not for everybody. Recreation, no having fun, at least not on a highly visible influencer tier scale, as we might call it today. Recreation was for specific family lines, and it was, in some of these societies, seen as a divine right. So God or gods install this family line as king, queen, right? Their kids inherit the right to rule until they're murked, murdered, ganked, shivved, defenestrated, as we'll see in Europe, so thrown out of a high window. Up until that American revolutionary idea of, no, actually these parks should be for all of us, it's for like the top fraction of a percent, right? So we talk about 1%ers in the United States, right? The billionaires and so forth. This is very much that kind of a thing, okay? But these are not capitalist societies. They are monarchies and so forth. So royalty gets the benefit, and everybody else makes the calories so that the royalty can do that. And the royalty in turn provide protection and education and keep that priestly class running. In India, there's a very complex system of religions emerging at this time, with up to millions of deities to sort of keep happy. All right? Now, they do also have this sort of nascent or newborn or just starting to come together idea of a public recreation area. And that would be a little bit more like, you guys ever been down to like that open green space next to the tracks downtown, kind of where 13 and 51 cross? Sometimes you'll see protesters there. Right now they're protesting about Palestine and Israel and stuff like that. It's just kind of an open space. And so when Carbondale has like a sunset concert series, or when there's like a music festival or something like that, that tends to be where Carbondale does those events. And ancient Indians were some of the first folks to start doing this. So in an era where everything is literally built by hand, we can't go to Lowe's and just buy a bunch of building materials. We gotta like work with somebody to bring on an ox cart, one tray load of bricks, like in ancient Egypt, or stonework in lots of parts of the world. And you gotta place those bricks and maybe slather them with mortar or mud or something to hold them together and seal it out from weather, right? Space is at an absolute premium in ancient societies because it is so much manual labor to build every foot of road, to build every square foot of house, and so forth. Okay? So this is a big deal. This is a really big deal. Even if it's just like an open little green or gathering space or something like that. And they tend to be in a lot of different cultures clustered around the well. So the town square idea of Western Europe and the early United States kind of has roots that are a couple of thousand years old. A spot for people to gather in public. And depending on how friendly that ruler is, maybe you can talk about public things. In the mid-1800s, it was a really big deal. It was seen as very, very important for American society to be able to gather freely in the town square and talk politics. And now we just sit at home unhappy on Twitter. Not that anybody uses Twitter or X anymore. But, I mean, it's all bots, right? But now we just sort of take pot shots at each other and gripe online and stuff like that. But back then, it was in these spots. So these are the best and highest understanding of what is important to a society. So a space for gathering, a space for recreation and leisure, that is, man, if we can elevate our nation state or even just our village above this hard scrabble, just clawing calories from the earth by the sweat of our brow, this is where we want to aim everything else. is what a lot of these ancient societies are saying. So this is a big deal, all right? In ancient China, we have a whole bunch of different indigenous people groups, some of which are reflected in modern populations today. A long while back, we have the Mongols. Anybody ever see the movie live action or animated Mulan? Okay, let's get down to business. We have a little bit later Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan, and these guys, it's hard to overstate the effect that any of these now Chinese people groups had across the entire known world of not just Asia, spanning 14 time zones, but also straight up into Europe, right? So Genghis Khan, Attila the Hun, at points these guys killed so many people that it caused a blip in the honest-to-God climatological record. So they killed so many people across Asia that the Asian forests started to regrow. Think about how many people it takes to do that. It's a lot. 1/4 of people in Asia, and particularly Southeast Asia now, 1/4 of people have direct genetic links to these conquerors. So direct descendants. This is also where we get the first horses domesticated, way back when, thousands of years ago. So Mongols, right, highly mobile, mounted infantry force, cavalry. And that's how they run rings around all these other militaries and just wreck face against Greeks and Persians and so forth. So we'll talk about ancient Persia here in a sec, and these guys will show up. What these guys give us in terms of forestry and recreation is the fact that their society was basically the inspiration for Khal Drogo and the Horse Lords of the Inland Sea, and to a lesser extent, if you're a J.R.R. Tolkien fan, the culture of Rohan, the horse-based, essentially Viking plus Mongol culture of the Rohirrim in the Lord of the Rings. Their society is built around that species, and your skill with a horse pretty directly sets your value and your place in that society. So being able to load, draw, and fire a short bow with military level accuracy on a horse that is galloping along is a valuable skill in a society that values conquering other folks more than it values settling down and farming. And so from this, we get not just military training, but the encoding of military training into the DNA of the culture, and things like their festivals and their equivalent of what we would call like a carnival or a state fair. They have events like this. So we have bull riding and barrel racing and cattle tipping and all sorts of cow-oriented things encoded as leisure and fun and competition and sport, like Professional Bull Riders Association, for example, today in modern America. Back then, it was exactly the same thing, except it was also your livelihood. And also when food was a little bit thin, right? Horse-based societies adapted to famine by learning to drink the blood of their horses to a limited extent for emergency calories and nutrients, right? So, all that to say, when warfare is encoded as leisure, encoded as sport, encoded as whatever else, that's a pretty clear sense of how humans understood the world. How are we going to be? We're going to be really good horsemen, and we're going to figure out how to conquer other peoples and make them feed us, basically, and so forth. Okay? So, right around the time of Roman occupation or the Roman Empire and conquering most of Europe and the Mediterranean and North Africa. Over in the inland sections of Southeast or East Asia, we have the invention of fireworks, black powder, gunpowder, stuff like that. And the sport or the leisure pastime at some of these many festivals, because there are lots of gods in Eastern religions typically, and so there are lots of holidays or holy days set aside for venerating different gods or groups of gods and so forth. And so we have fireworks, but not just fireworks. We find out a way to do leisure and fun with fireworks, as well as eventually warfare, right? 1,000 years later. So, dragon boat racing is another encoding of useful military and survival skills, boating, and sort of copy paste those from survival, subsistence farming, and fishing and so forth into things like festivals. So, at some of these festivals we have essentially the ancient equivalent of like jet boat racing, right? So have you guys ever seen racing boats? It's a surprisingly lethal sport. You get going a couple hundred miles an hour when your boat catches just a little bit too much of a wave and gets some air underneath it and flips and cartwheels and stuff like that. The person inside the cockpit is basically turned into a thin pink mist because water at speed is basically like hitting concrete over and over and over. So in ancient China, we have a fairly big calorie surplus with the use of night soul and so forth, and we start to see things like what will become forestry and forest recreation practices encoded first as military training and then sort of exported to the wider society with tournaments and competitions and sport and just fun, right? Firework catching doesn't sound like a lot of fun to me, but my frame of reference is modern fireworks that are magnesium-based and burning at 1,000 degrees. So, yeah, there we go. All right, so let's swing back to the west, back to the Mediterranean, just west of that Fertile Crescent where Babylon and ancient Mesopotamia are now essentially pretty long gone by this point. So in the 300s BCE, Aristotle is going to be our entry point into ancient Greek culture. So this is the pantheon of the Olympians. So if you have read any of the Percy Jackson stories, this is kind of the crew that first brought those stories to life here. All right. Now, in the Mediterranean climate, where it's sunny and 70 a whole lot of the time, and winters are pretty mild, it's subtropical, so you can get freezing weather, kill off a bunch of soil parasites, for example. That's useful. But you also don't have to eat a whole bunch of extra calories per day to keep your body warm enough through metabolism to survive through constant cold weather, right? We don't have to go through all the hard scrabble adaptations of anybody living above the Arctic Circle, for example. So here, that calorie surplus in all of these Greek nation states, so the Athenians versus the Trojans versus everybody else, right? Not the Carthaginians, Spartans, thank you. We have these sort of elaborations on the proto-ideas of what's the highest and best use of human life. So the Babylonians, the ancient Mesopotamians, the ancestral Chinese, they're giving us some early clues on, okay, once you solve the survival issue, what is right? What is best? What's the point? Why are we here? What do we do with ourselves? The ancient Greeks were one of the first groups. Now that the Phoenicians nearby have created an alphabet, a system of writing, and that technology has fully spread through this area by the 300 BCE time period. Now we have philosophers and a society where debate, public discussion, these are seen as very, very, very important. So these days we have Instagram influencers making duck lips and hawking bronzer and stuff like that, and Bitcoin schemes. Back then it was all talking about, okay, so how do we know that what we see is real? Like fundamental questions of philosophy, but higher order thought, all the stuff that is available to us after we solve our survival problems. And so Aristotle's take was recreation or recreation is one form of the disinterested cultivation of personality. Leave it to a nerd like a professor or a philosopher to take an idea like fun and make it totally unfun by thinking about the idea very intensely, right? It's like when you have to explain a joke, it's no longer funny. Anyway, so the idea here is that it's not good to go run a marathon. It's not good to exercise for its own sake, for the gains. It is good to, and it is a moral obligation to, draw yourself a little bit closer to the gods, to the paragon, or the archetype of what the ideal human should be. Recreation, fitness, having fun, leisure, resting, all of that stuff is in service to that. All right, so the disinterested cultivation of personality. You gotta be your best, you gotta do your best. You gotta figure out how to do the best you can, okay? And classic dead white guy take, right? Freedom from the necessity of labor. Yes, somebody's gotta grow a bunch of sheep, cattle, wheat, so we can have our gyros and our Greek chopped salads, but gosh, it'd be nice if not everybody had to do that, and it'd be nice if the folks who were doing that didn't have to do that all the time. So these city-states kind of organized ideas like democracy around this. That is, yeah, we have to have labor, but we have to push to get beyond the need to have labor. So the modern equivalent to this, the argument that we see in a lot of transhumanist circles or technological optimism circles, is the sense of, if we can automate with robots and AI stuff like sewage treatment, then nobody has to work 40 years in a sewage treatment plant. And maybe that's a good thing for society. Maybe if we give everybody universal basic income, then we can all focus a little bit more on living our best lives. Maybe is a modern equivalent of the disinterested cultivation of personality. Okay? And whether or not we agree with that, or think that that's a wise approach or not, Aristotle sure seemed to think so, and he's been a very influential person on Western civilizations ever since. So, let's end it right there. We'll see you on Thursday. I'll try not to have too heavy of a class on Thursday for us, but go ahead and look back through your notes from today. I'll try and post the class recording as soon as possible. I want to have a quick quiz before we get too far from this stuff. All right, won't be hard. Just on kinds of things we've been talking about. What you think about it? All right, see you on Thursday. Same time, same bat channel.